Iran accuses Britain of being a servant of the United States as it demands the return of a seized oil tanker. And the UK is considering boosting its military presence after a close encounter in the Gulf. With tensions rising by the day, what's the likelihood of open conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine Dennis. Now, the United States, the UK and Iran, they all agree on one thing. They don't want war. But the situation is becoming dangerous as the US turns the screw further on Iran's already faltering economy, and Britain finds itself in an awkward position. On the one hand, it's working with Europe to try to save the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which the US has abandoned. On the other, Britain needs to maintain close ties with Washington as it seeks to leave the European Union. It's been suggested that the seizure of the Iranian oil tanker off Gibraltar last week was done at the behest of the United States. And that's infuriated Iran, with the foreign minister demanding Britain return the ship or face what he called consequences.
The European Union's sanctions are meant to stop Europe from buying Syria's oil, not about another country selling oil to Syria. So this is a very childish and ridiculous excuse by the British. They should officially say, we're servants of America and act on behalf of America. America has returned the favour by insulting their ambassador and their prime minister.
But Gibraltar's chief minister says there was no foreign interference.
All relevant decisions in respect of this matter were taken as a direct result only of the government of Gibraltar having reasonable grounds to believe that the vessel was acting in breach of established EU sanctions against Syria. There has been no political request at any time from any government that the Gibraltar government should act or not act on one basis or another.
So we have to remember, of course, that Gibraltar is a British territory, and there's been incremental ratcheting up of tension within the past week in the Gulf. British Royal Marines seized that Iranian oil tanker off the coast of Gibraltar, as we've mentioned, because of the suspicion of it violating sanctions against Syria. A former commander of Iran's Revolutionary Guard suggested a British vessel should be taken in retaliation. On Tuesday, the UK raised the threat to British shipping in the Gulf to its highest level. And the following day, a UK warship says it stopped Iranian military boats from impeding a British oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, though, denies this incident ever happened. Time to introduce our guests now. On Skype in London, we have Anise Basiri Tabrizi, who is Research Fellow at RUSI, that's the Royal United Services Institute. In Tehran, we have Mohammed Marandi, Head of American Studies Department at the University of Tehran. Also in London, we have Phil Diacon, who's Managing Director of Dryad Global. That's a maritime security risk management company. Welcome to you all. And Phil, can I start with you and just ask you to give us a very general assessment of what the maritime security situation in the Gulf currently is, with, we understand, the British sending another warship to the region and ratcheting up its security alert level.
So the increase in the security level that was announced yesterday for British interest vessels is, as you say, the highest level of security that can be applied to a vessel. What that effectively means is that you're restricting the movement of personnel on the vessel and on and off the vessel. Also, along with the industry best management practice, that's the BMP5, along with that, which might imply physical security measures, what you're doing is you're providing the biggest barriers to boarding, allowing people to interfere with your vessel. But in essence, that's as far as it goes. So in terms of the security raised in the area and the British ability to influence that, what we had go on Tuesday was effectively what the Iranians have been doing for quite some time now. And we have to put this into context. Our clients have been reporting this sort of activity for many years now, where the Iranian Guard operating their vessels will try and steer vessels away from their course and try and encourage them into areas where they have more direct influence, i.e. Iranian territorial waters, where they can perhaps take steps further and pursue their own agendas.
And what would that be? I mean, what's your understanding from what you're hearing from your clients, your customers in the region? What is the objective? What are these Iranians seeking to achieve?
So the harassment activity that we've seen here, and it's the alleged activity that took place 2 days ago with the British vessel. Now remember that British vessel, the thing to note with that is that it might be under a red ensign, which comes under the sort of British flags of convenience, but actually that vessel has many interested parties in it. So there were EU interests, there were Chinese interests, there were Dutch interests, there were Chinese interests. So most vessels that pass through those areas have interests from many nations. Unlike the Grey Swan, which was a single, carrying the single cargo, which was Iranian cargo, and it was headed towards Syria. Interfering, as the Iranians would say, with that vessel doesn't have the same impact. All
right, let's go to Mohammed now and ask what he thinks is the scenario in the Gulf right now. Is it a case of this US campaign of maximum pressure not allowing Iran to export one drop of its oil, and therefore Iran saying, well, that it's going to obstruct the whole industry for the rest of the world as well?
No, I don't think that this particular incident really happened. And while there are cases where the Iranian Navy may take action against particular ships or behave in a particular manner, it's usually in response to what the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Americans do to Iranian ships. So this is something that's been happening for a long time. But in this particular case, if the Iranians had decided to take an oil tanker, they would have taken it. The British cannot stop the Iranians. This is, after all, the Persian Gulf. The Iranians have
Mohammed,
bases on
the
key islands.
Sorry, is it just a matter of nuisance value then, the Iranian Navy wanting to cause a bit of a headache and to create a bit of a problem for people then in the Gulf?
No, as I said, this is something that the different sides do. But on this particular occasion, I think probably nothing happened. And what really happened was that the Americans, immediately after they they called for the establishment of a naval task force that would be obviously hostile towards Iran and work alongside the Iranian coast. This so-called incident happened. And we had different, it was reported in different ways by the Americans. The Americans initially said there were 5 boats. The British then said there were 3 boats. And the Americans who said there were 5 boats, they were military officials. So even the story itself, it was inconsistent. The Iranians said nothing happened. As I said, if the Iranians wanted to take a boat, there's nothing that the British could have done. So the Iranians have a very strong presence in the Persian Gulf. And so I think that it's basically the British appeasing the Americans. And even the oil tanker, not that the Iranians may not take a ship later on, but when they do seek a ship, they will take it. And that will probably be in retaliation to the fact that the British hijacked an Iranian ship. And the Iranian ship was taken at the behest of the Americans, although the Gibraltar government says otherwise, but apparently the Spanish foreign minister didn't receive the memo. He said specifically that the Americans asked for this ship to be taken.
All right. Now, coming to you, Anise, in London, I suppose our starting point needs to be the seizure of this Iranian oil tanker in the Strait of Gibraltar, obviously Gibraltar being a British territory, and the sequence of events starting from that point to where we are now. Do you think that it was a calculated action taken by British authorities to seize this ship, even though it was apparently in contravention of sanctions against Syria? But was it a calculated action taken by the British government, would you think?
I think obviously at the moment the stakes are really high for both sides. So what we are seeing is, as Phil was describing, some repetition of instances that were already probably taking place, incidents that were already taking place, but that are placed in a very different context in which the stakes are higher and the two sides are taking a much stronger position. We are seeing, especially over the past 2 months, a translation from a strong stronger rhetoric to stronger actions in practice, both from the Iranian side and the European side. So I don't know the specific of this instance and whether that was in retaliation for the Iranian, for instance, reprising their nuclear activities, or whether it was a decision from the UK to basically take a stance which is closer to the US. But we are seeing a growing tendency by both sides to toughening up their rhetoric, but also to take harsher measures which were not taken before.
And staying with you, Anissa, because the UK is finding itself, isn't it, as Mohammed has pointed out, it's finding itself in a very awkward position. It's about to leave the European Union, we expect, and therefore is vulnerable, as he put it, or in even more greater need, if you like, of US patronage, and certainly in the form of a big fat trade deal. So they're prepared to do what it takes to keep that relationship going. Would you agree with that?
Just to some extent. I think the expectation was the same with regard to the nuclear deal. When, for instance, the US president decided first to decertify the US and then to withdraw the US from the nuclear deal, there was the expectation that the UK might break ranks with the rest of the EU and position itself closer to the US. But that did not happen. We have seen actually a closing up of the ranks between the UK and the other E3, France and Germany in particular. So it really depends on the front which we are talking about. I think on the nuclear issue, as correctly reported at the beginning, the UK has been still maintaining its position of defending the nuclear deal, defending up until recently the compliance of Iran with its nuclear obligation, and doing everything it could really to attempt for the deal to survive.
Right.
On the regional front, however, historically, I think the UK has taken a closer position to the US. So this is what we are seeing at the moment.
Right, Phil, coming back to the situation on the ground, or I should say on the water, really. So the situation is very tense indeed. We've got the highest level of alert when it comes to British maritime forces. Have you ever seen a situation as tense as this before in your experience? And obviously many people will be thinking back to the late 1980s and what was known as the tanker war.
I mean, historically, these events have occurred, obviously, through time. We mustn't forget that, and it seems like ages ago now, but, 2007, the incident with the HMS Cornwall, where 15 members of the Royal Navy were arrested by the Iranian Guard with small boats. That incident occurred, and that led to a rise in tensions and increase in security levels. But that was only 2007, but yet that seems like a long time ago. And I think we do need to think, it's very interesting timing from the British to take the Grace One, the Iranian tanker, to arrest it off Gibraltar, because they would have known that would have led to consequences that we're starting to see here. And also the American attempt to start creating a coalition to support vessels going through the Straits of Hormuz. We've seen this sort of thing before. In fact, we see it going on currently, but in a different environment in the Gulf of Aden, where we've got flotillas, or rather we've got convoy escorts that go through the Gulf of Aden, which was set up against piracy threat at the time. And that's still going on, although the piracy threat has diminished. But the biggest difference is that the potential for escalation in that environment is so much less than it is in the Gulf of Hormuz.
Right.
So any coalition that is built has to take that into account.
Now, Mohammed, given this kind of exceedingly tense environment, I would imagine that there's very little chance for dialogue. But how much hope is there in Tehran being invested in the Europeans and their ability to come up with this alternative system? Instex is the way is what it's being called, to try to mitigate, if you like, the effects of these harsh American sanctions.
Well, we have to keep in mind that the only side that has been abiding by the nuclear deal over the last 14 months is Iran. And this is something that the Western media and the Western think tanks really rarely say. There are people who point this out, but it's not really known by the Western public that Iran has been faithfully abiding by the deal. And even now that it's beginning to reduce its commitments, it's only doing so to force the Europeans to take a stand, because the Europeans have all sorts of commitments. They have been violating all of them because of bullying from Washington. And so the Iranians are saying, look, we cannot continue like this. The Iranian public will not accept it. The Iranian public is becoming increasingly frustrated, and they expect the government to take action. And so the government is becoming more forceful in its attitude and its position towards the EU. I'm not very optimistic about the EU, but I do think that it's in the interest of the EU to change its policy and to stand up to the United States. It has an economy that by some calculations is larger than the United States, and it has a population that's larger than the United States. And the Russians and the Chinese are resisting the United States. So there's no reason why the EU, especially in coordination with the Russians and the Chinese, cannot do a lot more than what it's doing now. But ultimately, if the EU doesn't take a stance, then we may move towards greater escalation, and that's what the Americans are pushing for. When Trump speaks about obliterating Iran, he said that a number of times already, which is basically a threat of Holocaust. He's threatening Iran with nuclear strikes, but we don't see any European leader or any major media outlet showing shock or condemning such language. On the other hand, Trump himself says that he's carrying out economic warfare, and he's bullying other countries not to do trade with Iran.
Right.
You cannot purchase medicine through the banking sector in Iran. And right now, there are examples of people who've gone without their medicine for cancer because it's so expensive. They don't want their family to live in destitute, so they choose to die as a result. This is the policy that the Europeans and the Americans are pursuing.
Anise, so Mohammed is suggesting that the Europeans could actually do a great deal more in terms of helping Iran's economy out of this tight squeeze that's being placed upon it by the American campaign. Do you think the Europeans do have that latitude? If so, if they do have it and they're not actually exercising it, what's holding them back?
Look, I think the Iranians have rightfully the expectation that the Europeans would do more in terms of the way they describe it, compensate for the US withdrawal from the nuclear deal. This was very much the expectation since last year, since May 2018. And the two requests from the Iranian side were very much clear since then, meaning the connection to the financial global system and the continuation of its ability to export oil. With the INSTEX mechanism, obviously, the Europeans invested very much on the financial connection side. However, that is very limited in itself. First of all, it's not really ongoing at the moment, despite the operationalization, and it's very limited on the humanitarian goods only. And we have seen the continuation of Iran's inability to sell its oil to the pre-sanctions level. So it's clear that the Iranian expectations have not met. In terms of the European capabilities, obviously, what we have seen so far has been very limited compared to the Iranian expectation, but has also been unprecedented compared to historically to stand up to the US in terms of institutionalizing a financial mechanism and introducing a blocking regulation and so on and so forth. If we were talking back in late 2017, there was no expectation whatsoever that this was going to happen. Obviously, much more could be done, but I think it requires time, and time is really not anyone's friend at the moment.
Right, Mohammed, so you talked a little bit earlier about the possibility of Iran escalating, if you like, its non-compliance with the terms of what remains of the JCPOA. Is Iran prepared to go so far as to render it completely obsolete, tear it up and walk away? Is Iran prepared for that?
Yes, I think that Iran ultimately is willing to do that, because if the Europeans do not take steps to abide by their commitments, then there's no reason for Iran to stay. But the reason why the Iranians are gradually reducing their commitments is to give the Europeans an opportunity to do something. I mean, what the Europeans have done so far is really nothing. INSTEX may be a political statement, but it's an empty vessel. It doesn't do anything. There has to be money in it. European companies are afraid to purchase Iranian oil. Well, if they're afraid, then the European governments can purchase oil. Are they that afraid of the United States? Right now, the Chinese are purchasing Iranian oil increasingly as we speak. The Russians are cooperating with Iran. So the Iranians simply don't buy it that the Europeans can't do anything. And if they really can't do anything, then the Europeans should not be sitting at the negotiating table. They should step aside because they're not of significance. But the Iranians, I think what is even more important is that the Iranians are more than prepared to defend themselves. And this escalation that the Americans are pursuing is very dangerous. This is not 1988, where the Americans can down an Iranian airliner, killing 290 people and nothing happens. This is an Iran today which shoots down a $200 million American drone with a $20,000 Iranian-made drone.
All right.
Iran has underground installations from the Iraqi border alongside the Persian Gulf to the Strait of Hormuz to Pakistan with tens of thousands of precision-guided missiles. And Iran has allies across the region.
Indeed.
In 1988, Iran was isolated and surrounded.
OK, a very different time today. Phil, coming back to you, I'm just wondering a little bit more about the situation in the Gulf itself. How easy would it be, if you like, would it be for there to be an unintentional ratcheting up of tensions which could lead to direct conflict? I'm particularly referring to Britain at the moment because that's where our focus is today. How likely is it that it could just unintentionally spiral out of control?
I think you've hit the nail on the head there with the unintentional side of it. I think everyone's aware of the implicit dangers of putting military assets into an area such as this. I mean, one of the biggest dangers is the unintentional event that leads on to escalation. Donald Trump has been pushing for the US to lead a coalition, but doesn't want to be doing it on their own. So trying to build a coalition because, as he rightly points out, most of the oil that goes through there, and our customers are the ones who are transporting this oil through the Straits, most of that oil is going out to China, Japan, India. America will be a net exporter of energy by next year, so actually its requirement to keep the lanes open, it's purely for the flow of oil, for example, is much less than other nations. Hence the need to build a coalition because they don't want to pay for it. That suits Trump's agenda. So he's saying that basically America first and able to build the coalition. But the thing with coalitions, and this goes right back to your point, is that when you build a coalition, all the operators will operate under their own national rules of engagement and their ways of operating. When you've got that situation, you could have situations develop where an event occurs that is not necessarily supported or would be followed in the same way by another nation. So coalitions in that sense, in this tinderbox environment, they will be thinking very carefully about committing to this area. Going back to your point about the British. Sorry, go on.
No, please finish, but be quick if you will, because we are running out of time, Phil, please.
No, it's absolutely. So the British involvement in the area, because we have British interests in the area, the British will, of course, do what they can. But in terms of the effectiveness of all those vessels going through the area, it is an enormous challenge to have a full effective policing effort to prevent things like this happening. If you've got arms in an area like this, there's always escalation potential.
Right. And Anise, looking at the British position right now, it seems as though they're increasingly in this almost a vice-like situation. How desirable or otherwise is it for the UK to be seen, to be viewed by others as a proxy for the United States? And I have to ask you to be brief, please.
I think the UK is really willing to be somewhere between the EU and the US at the moment. I don't think it wants to be perceived as a proxy of the US. I don't think it wants to fully align to the US policy on Iran because there is so much disagreement internationally towards the US policy on Iran. But the closer the tension gets between the US and Iran, the more the provocation from the Iranian side or the measures taken by the Iranian side to which the UK needs to respond, the more likely it is that the UK will shift towards the US.
Thank you all very much indeed. Anise Basseri Tabrisi, Mohamed Marandi, and Phil Diacon. Thank you all very much indeed. Really interesting conversation. And as ever, thank you for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. If you want to continue with this conversation, you can go to our Facebook page, facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. So from me and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.